There were several points of discussion during the convention, especially one on the propriety of women taking any part in social meetings. Dr. Beecher brought up that objection and argued it at length, insisting upon it that the practice was unscripturable and inadmissible. To this, Dr. Beeman replied in a very short address, showing conclusively that this practice was familiar to the apostles, and that in the 11th chapter of Corinthians, the apostle called the attention of the church to the fact that Christian women had given a shock to Eastern ideas by their practice of taking part and praying in their religious meetings without their veils. He showed clearly that the apostle did not complain of their taking part in the meeting, but of the fact that they did so laying aside their veils, which had given a shock to the prevalent sentiment and occasion of reproach to heathen opposers. The apostle did not reprove the practice of their praying, but simply admonished them to wear their veils when they did so. To this reply of Dr. Beeman, no answer was made or attempted. It was manifestly too conclusive to admit of any refutation. Near the close of the convention, Mr. Nettleton came in, manifestly very much agitated, and said that he would now give the convention to understand the reasons he had for the course he had taken. He had what he called a historical letter in which he professed to give the reasons and state the facts upon which he had founded his opposition. I was glad to hear the announcement that he wished to read this letter to the convention. A copy of it had been sent to Mr. Aiken when I was laboring with him in Utica, and Mr. Aiken had given it to me. I had it in my possession at the convention and should have called it up in due time had not Mr. Nettleton done so. He went on to read the letter. It was a statement under distinct heads of the things of which he complained and which he had been informed were practiced in those revivals, and especially by myself. It is evident that the letter was aimed at me particularly, though perhaps I was seldom mentioned in it by name. Yet the things complained of were so presented that there was no mistaking the design. The convention listened attentively to the whole letter, which was as long as a sermon. Mr. Nettleton then observed that the convention had before them the facts upon which he had acted, and which he supposed had called for and justified his proceedings. When he sat down, I arose and expressed my satisfaction that the letter had been read, and remarked that I had a copy of it and should have read it in due time if Mr. Nettleton had not done so. I then affirmed that so far as I was personally concerned, not one of those facts mentioned there and complained of was true. And I added, all the brethren are here with whom I have performed all these labors, and they know whether I am chargeable with any of these things in any of their congregations. If they know or believe that any of these things are true of me, let them say so now and here. They all at once affirmed, either by expressly saying so or by their manifest acquiescence, that they knew of no such thing. Mr. Weeks was present, and I expected, therefore, that if anything was said in reply to my explicit denial of all the facts charged in Mr. Nettleton's letter with respect to myself, that it would come from Mr. Weeks. I supposed that if he had written to Dr. Beecher or Mr. Nettleton affirming those facts, that he would feel called upon then and there to speak out and justify what he had written. But he said not a word. No one there pretended to justify a single sentence in Mr. Nettleton's historical letter that related to myself. This, of course, was astounding to Mr. Nettleton and Dr. Beecher. If any of their supposed facts had been received from Mr. Weeks, no doubt they expected him to speak out and justify what he had written. But he said nothing intimating that he had any knowledge of any of the facts that Mr. Nettleton had presented in his letter. The reading of this letter and what immediately followed prepared the way for closing up the convention. And now follow some things that I am sorry to be obliged to mention. Mr. Justin Edwards had been present during all the discussions, and had attended, I believe, all the sessions of the convention. He was a very intimate friend of Dr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton, and he must have seen clearly how the whole thing stood. At whose suggestion I do not know, near the close of the convention he brought in a string of resolutions in which, from step to step, he resolved to disapprove of such and such and such measures in the promotion of revivals. He went over in his resolutions nearly, if not quite, every specification contained in Mr. Nettleton's historical letter, disapproving of all the things of which Mr. Nettleton had complained. When he had read his resolutions, it was said immediately by several of the brethren from the West, "We approve of these resolutions, but what is their design? It is manifest that their design is to make the public impression that such things have been practiced, and that this convention, condemning those practices, condemns the brethren that have been engaged in those revivals, and that this convention justifies, therefore, the opposition that has been made." Dr. Beecher insisted that the design of the resolutions was entirely prospective, that nothing was asserted or implied with respect to the past, but that they were merely to serve as landmarks and to let it be known that the convention disapproved of such things, if they ever should exist, with no implication whatever that any such things had been done. It was immediately replied that from the fact that such complaints had gone abroad, and it was publicly known that such charges had been made, it was evident that these resolutions were designed to sustain the brethren who had made the opposition, and to make the impression that such things had been done in those revivals as were condemned in the resolutions. It was indeed perfectly plain that such was the meaning of those resolutions on the part of Mr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton. The brethren from the West said, "Of course we shall vote for these resolutions. We believe in these things as much as you do, and we as much disapprove of the practices condemned in these resolutions as you do yourselves. Therefore we cannot help voting for them. But we believe that they are intended to justify this opposition, to have a retrospective rather than a prospective application." However, we passed the resolutions, I believe, unanimously, and I recollect saying that for my part I was willing that these resolutions should go forth, and that all the facts should be left to the publication and adjudication of the solemn judgment. I then proposed that before we dismissed we should pass a resolution against lukewarmness in religion, and condemning it as strongly as any of the practices mentioned in the resolutions. Dr. Beecher declared that there was no danger of lukewarmness at all, whereupon the convention adjourned sine die. How the publication of the whole proceedings was received by the public, I need not say. In the second volume of the biography of Dr. Beecher, page 101, I find the following note by the editor. He says, "A careful perusal of the minutes of this convention has satisfied us that there was no radical difference of views between the Western brethren and those from New England, and that but for the influence of one individual, the same settlement might have been made there, which was afterward effected in Philadelphia. This is no doubt true. The fact is that had not Mr. Nettleton listened to false reports and got committed against those revivals, no convention would have been held upon this subject or thought of. It was all the more wonderful that he should have credited such reports, since he had so often been made the subject of manifold misrepresentations. But he was nearly worn out, had become exceedingly nervous, and was of course fearful and easily excited, and withal had the infirmity attributed to him by Dr. Beecher in his biography of never giving up his own will. I am sure that I say this without entirely kind feeling toward Mr. Nettleton. I am sure that I say this with entirely kind feeling toward Mr. Nettleton. I never entertained or had any other." After this convention, the reaction of public feeling was overwhelming. Late in the fall of the same year, I met Mr. Nettleton in the city of New York. He told me he was there to give his letters against the Western revivals to the public in pamphlet form. I asked him if he would publish his historical letter, which he had read before the convention. He said he must publish his letters to justify what he had done. I told him if he published that letter, it would react against himself, as all who were acquainted with those revivals would see that he was acting without a valid reason. He replied that he should publish his letters and would risk the reaction. He published several other letters, but that one he did not publish so far as I could learn. If it had been true, the publication of it would have made the impression that his opposition had been called for. But as it was not true, it was well for him that he did not publish it. Here I must take a slight notice of things I find in Dr. Beecher's biography, about which I think there must have been some misunderstanding. The biography represents him as having justified his opposition to those revivals, that is, to the manner in which they were conducted, until the day of his death, and as having maintained that the evils complained of were real and were corrected by the opposition. If this was his opinion after that convention, he must still have believed that the brethren who testified that no such things had been done were a set of liars, and he must have wholly rejected our united testimony. But as he and Mr. Nettleton were exceedingly anxious to justify their opposition, if they still believed those statements in the historical letter were to be true, why did they not publish it and appeal to those who were on the ground and witnessed the revivals? Had the letter been true, its publication would have been their justification. If they still believed it true, why was it not published with Mr. Nettleton's other letters? That the developments made at that convention had shaken the confidence of Dr. Beecher in the wisdom and justice of Mr. Nettleton's opposition, I had inferred from the fact that during my labors in Boston, a year and a half after the convention, and after Mr. Nettleton's letters were published, Dr. Beecher, speaking of that convention, remarked that after that he, quote, would not have had Mr. Nettleton come to Boston for $1,000, unquote. Is it possible that until his death, Dr. Beecher continued to believe that the pastors of those churches where those revivals occurred were liars, and had not to be believed in regard to the facts which must have been within their personal knowledge? I find in the biographies of Dr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton much complaint of the bad spirit that prevailed in those revivals. Their mistake lies in their attributing a spirit of denunciation on the wrong side. I never heard the name of Dr. Beecher or Mr. Nettleton mentioned during those revivals in public that I recollect, and certainly not censoriously. They were never, even in private conversation, spoken of, to my knowledge, with the least bitterness. The friends and promoters of those revivals were in sweet Christian spirit and as far as possible from being denunciatory. If they had been in a denunciatory spirit, those blessed revivals could never have been promoted by them, and the revivals could never have turned out as gloriously as they did. No, the denunciation was on the side of the opposition. A quotation from Dr. Beecher's biography will illustrate the animus of the opposition. In the second volume, page 101, Dr. Beecher is represented as saying to me at the convention at New Lebanon, "Finney, I know your plan, and you know I do. You mean to come to Connecticut and carry a streak of fire to Boston. But if you attempt it, as the Lord liveth, I'll meet you at the state line and call out all the artillerymen and fight every inch of the way to Boston, and then I'll fight you there." Unquote. I do not remember this, but as Dr. Beecher does, let me illustrate the spirit of his opposition. The fact is, he was grossly deceived at every step. I had no design, nor desire to go to Connecticut nor to Boston. The above and many other things which I find in his biography show how completely he was deceived, and how utterly ignorant he was of the character and motives and doings of those who had labored in those glorious revivals. I write these things with no pleasure. I find much in this biography that surprises me, and leads me to the conclusion that by some mistake Dr. Beecher has been misunderstood and misrepresented, but I pass by other matters. After this convention, I heard no more of the opposition of Dr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton. Opposition in that form has spent itself. The results of the revivals were such as to shut the mouths of gainsayers and convince everybody that they were indeed pure and glorious revivals of religion, and as far from anything objectionable as any revivals that ever were witnessed in this world. Let anyone read the Acts of the Apostles and the record of the revivals of their day, and then read what they say in their epistles of the reaction, backsliding, and apostasies that followed. Then let them find out the truth respecting the glorious revivals of which I have been writing, their commencement, progress, and results, which have been more and more manifest for nearly 40 years, and they cannot fail to see that these revivals were as truly from God as those. Revival should increase in purity and power as intelligence increases. The converts in apostolic times were either Jews with all their prejudice and ignorance, or degraded heathen. The art of printing had not been discovered. Copies of the Old Testament and of the written Word of God were not to be had except by the rich, who were able to purchase manuscript copies. Christianity had no literature that was accessible to the masses. The means of instruction were not at hand. With so much darkness and ignorance, with so many false notions of religion, with so much to mislead and debase, with so few facilities for sustaining a religious reformation, it was not to be expected that revivals of religion should be pure and free from errors. We have and preach the same gospel that the apostles preached. We have every facility for guarding against error in doctrine and practice, and for securing a sound gospel religion. The people among whom these great revivals prevailed were an intelligent, cultivated people. They had not only the means of secular but also of religious education, abounding in their midst. Nearly every church had an educated, able, and faithful pastor. These pastors were well able to judge of the soundness and discretion of an evangelist whose labors they wished to enjoy. They were well able to judge the propriety of the measures employed. God set His seal to the doctrines that were preached and to the means that were used to carry forward that great work in a most striking and remarkable manner. The results are now found in all parts of the land. The converts of those revivals are still living and laboring for Christ and for souls in almost or quite every state in this Union. It is but just to say that they are among the most intelligent and useful Christians in this or any other country. As I have since labored extensively in this country and in Great Britain, and no exceptions have been taken to my measures, it has been assumed and asserted that since the opposition made by Mr. Nettleton and Dr. Beecher, I have been reformed and have given up the measures they complained of. This is an entire mistake. I have always and everywhere used all the measures I used in those revivals, and have often added other measures whenever I have deemed it expedient. I have never seen the necessity of reformation in this respect. Were I to live my life over again, I think that with the experience of more than 40 years in revival labors, I should, under the same circumstances, use substantially the same measures that I did then. And let me not be understood to take credit to myself. No, indeed. It was no wisdom of my own that directed me. I was made to feel my ignorance and dependence, and led to look to God continually for His guidance. I had no doubt then, nor have I ever had, that God led me by His Spirit to take the course I did. So clearly did He lead me from day to day that I never did or could doubt that I was divinely directed. That the brethren who opposed those revivals were good men, I do not doubt. That they were misled and grossly and most injuriously deceived, I have just as little doubt. If they died under the belief that they had just reasons for what they did and wrote and said, and that they corrected the evils of which they complained, they died grossly deceived in this respect. It is not for the safety of the church, the honor of revivals, or the glory of Christ that posterity should believe that those evils existed and were corrected by such a spirit and in such a manner as has been represented. I should have remained silent had not so marked an effort been made to perpetuate and confirm the delusion that the opposition to those revivals was justifiable and successful. The fact is, it was neither. I have no doubt that Dr. Beecher was led by somebody to believe that his opposition was called for. From his biography, it appears that at Philadelphia, the next spring after the convention, it was agreed by himself, Dr. Beeman, and others to drop the subject and publish no more in regard to those revivals. The truth is that all the controversy and all the publishing had been on the side of the opposition. Previously to the meeting at Philadelphia, Mr. Nettleton had published his letters, and I saw nothing farther in print upon the subject. I was not a party to the agreement entered into at Philadelphia. Nevertheless, had not Dr. Beecher's biography reopened this subject with a manifest design to justify the course that he took and rivet the impression upon the public mind that in making that opposition to those revivals he performed a great and good work, I should not feel called upon to say what I cannot now be justified in withholding. I write from personal knowledge, and to me it matters not who may have given to Dr. Beecher the supposed facts upon which he acted. Those asserted facts were no facts, as I stated before the convention, to which statement every brother with whom I had labored assented. This was proof, if anything can be proven, by human testimony. This testimony, it would seem, Dr. Beecher did not believe, if his biographer has not misrepresented him. And what will the churches in Oneida County say to this? Can they believe that such men as Dr. Aiken, Reverend John Frost, Reverend Moses Gillette, Reverend Mr. Coe, and the other men from that county who attended that convention deliberately falsified upon a subject which was within their own personal knowledge? It matters not who Dr. Beecher's informants were. Certainly none of the pastors where those revivals prevailed ever gave him any information that justified his course, and no other men understood the matter as well as they did. I submit that, as the convention decided, they were the best possible witnesses of what was said and done in their own congregations, and their testimony was unanimous that no such things were done as were charged. I had read the strong and even terrible charges against the brethren who labored in those revivals contained in Dr. Beecher's letter to Dr. Taylor, in which he states that his correspondence will justify what he was doing and writing against those brethren. When I learned that this matter was to be spread before the public in Dr. Beecher's biography, I hoped that at last we should get at the authors of those reports through the publication of his correspondence. But I see nothing in his correspondence to justify his course. Are these charges to be virtually repeated and stereotyped, and the correspondence by which they are said to be justified concealed? If, as it seems, Dr. Beecher, until the day of his death, continued to reject our united testimony, may we not know by whose counter-testimony ours is impeached? On page 103 of the second volume of Dr. Beecher's autobiography, we have the following, quote, "In the spring of 1828, unquote, said Dr. Beecher in conversation on the subject, resuming, I found out that Mr. Finney's friends were laying their plans to make an impression on the General Assembly that held its session at Philadelphia, and to get one of their men into Mr. Skinner's place. Skinner's church had just asked me to preach for them, and I wrote back that I would supply if they wished while the assembly was in session. That blocked somebody's wheels. I stayed till the close, when Beeman preached half a day. That defeated their plans. They failed." End of quote. What this means I cannot say. In reading the above and what follows to the end of the chapter, together with what I find elsewhere on this subject in this biography, I stand amazed in view of the suspicions and delusions under which Dr. Beecher's mind was laboring. If any of my friends were trying to get into Dr. Skinner's pulpit, which he had vacated, I have no recollection of ever having heard of it. I was at that time a minister in the Presbyterian Church, and was preaching in Philadelphia when the assembly was in session, and while Dr. Beecher was there. I was as ignorant as a child of all this management revealed in the biography. I shared none of the terrors and distractions that seem to have so much distressed Dr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton. If any of my friends were sharing in the state of mind in which these brethren were, I knew it not. The truthful record of my labors up to the time of the convention, and from that time onward, will show how little I knew or cared what Dr. Beecher and Mr. Nettleton were saying or doing about me. I bless the Lord that I was kept from being diverted from my work by their opposition, and that I never gave myself any uneasiness about it. When at Auburn, as I have related, God had given me the assurance that He would overrule all opposition without my turning aside to answer my opposers. This I never forgot. Under this divine assurance, I went forward with a single eye and a trustful spirit. And now, when I read what agitations, suspicions, and misapprehensions possessed the minds of these brethren, I stand amazed at their delusion and consequent anxiety respecting myself and my labors. At the very time that Dr. Beecher was in Philadelphia, managing with members of the General Assembly as related in his biography, I was laboring in that city and had been for several months in different churches in the midst of a powerful revival of religion, perfectly ignorant of Dr. Beecher's errand there. I cannot be too thankful that God kept me from being agitated and changed in my spirit or views of labor by all the opposition of those days.